Justice for the family and friends of Breneisha Lightfoot. Today, a judge found her boyfriend guilty of involuntary manslaughter, tampering with evidence, and gross abuse of a corpse. Tonight, Lightfoot's friends, they spoke to our Remy Murray on the latest in this tragic case.
After more than 7 months since Bedford police found Breneisha Lightfoot's body in Cleveland's Slavic Village neighborhood, friends of Lightfoot say they're happy justice is being served.
The young man got what he deserved.
But Sincere Shakur says he's still at a loss for words.
There's still a void. Anytime you lose somebody of that caliber of character in that young lady, it will forever haunt you.
On Wednesday, Judge Dina R. Calabrese found Lightfoot's boyfriend, Michael Roarty-Nugent, guilty of involuntary manslaughter, tampering with evidence, and gross abuse against a human corpse.
It's just a tragedy that it had to end like that.
There's still a void. Her death is very hard to digest. The words of a friend, trembling, broken, almost too heavy to speak. In the quiet of Cleveland's Slavic Village, a neighborhood scarred by hardship and history, police lights cut through the night. Yellow tape flutters in the breeze. A lifeless body lies hidden in shadows, discarded as if it were nothing more than trash. But this wasn't trash. This was a young woman with a name, a face, a future. Her family's cries pierced the air. Bring her back to us. Someone please tell us why. The shocking discovery sent ripples through the city. A rising rapper, a beloved mentor to kids in her community, suddenly silenced. And the man at the center of it all, the one who should have loved her most, was now the suspect. For days, unanswered calls and unanswered prayers built a wall of dread. Then, a devastating confirmation. Breneisha Lightfoot was gone. The apartment showed signs of violence. The body was found miles away, dumped in a neighborhood already haunted by too many tragedies. So why did this happen? Why was her light extinguished by the man she trusted? This isn't just a story of a crime. It's a story of betrayal, silence, and a chilling answer to one haunting question. Why was Breneisha Lightfoot killed? Let's find out.
Welcome to Twisted Crimes Files, where the darkest truths come to light. Stay with us for chilling stories you won't forget, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a case.
Her name was Breneisha Lightfoot, 26 years old, a young woman who carried 2 titles with equal pride, artist and mentor. By day, she poured her energy into community work, teaching children life-saving skills through the Wolfpack gunshot response team. By night, she was chasing her dream as a rapper, her lyrics echoing the struggles and resilience of Cleveland life. But on the morning of July 21st, 2023, her name wasn't on a stage or a studio track. It was scribbled into a police report. Her body had been discovered in the worn-down streets of Slavic Village, a neighborhood with a history of poverty, violence, and survival. The call that led police there began just 3 days earlier, July 18th, when family members, worried about her silence, begged Bedford police for a welfare check. Officers found troubling signs in her apartment, but no sign of Breneisha herself. Hours turned into days, days into dread. When the truth surfaced, it carried with it the weight of betrayal. Breneisha had been killed, and the one accused was not a stranger in the shadows, but her own boyfriend, Michael Roarty-Nugent. So begins a story that shakes not only a family, but an entire community. Because the question is no longer who took her life. It's why. And behind that why lies a chilling unraveling of love, violence, and the choices that end in tragedy. Long before headlines, before courtrooms and crime tape, there was simply a girl from Cleveland with a fire in her spirit. Breneisha Lightfoot was born into a family that cherished her smile, the kind of smile that could soften even the hardest day. She grew up in neighborhoods where opportunity wasn't always guaranteed, but where creativity and resilience could shine brighter than despair. Music became her language, a way to turn pain into poetry, to transform the weight of life into verses that others could feel. On social media, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew her voice mattered, her followers watching as she shaped herself into a rising star. But it wasn't just about music. Friends remember her as nurturing, someone who would stop to check on a neighbor, someone who would hold space for others' pain. She gave children lessons that went beyond the classroom: how to treat wounds, how to stay calm in emergencies, how to fight for tomorrow, even when today feels broken. They called her Miss Bree, a mentor, a sister, a safe place. Those who knew her best describe her as fearless but gentle, playful yet deeply thoughtful. She loved to laugh, to record candid videos, to share the behind-the-scenes of a young woman trying to build a future out of fragments of hope. She was the kind of person people gravitated toward, not because of fame, but because of heart. To the outside world, she was a rapper on the rise. To her community, she was a lifeline. To her family, she was irreplaceable. And that's what makes the tragedy ahead so devastating. Because Breneisha Lightfoot was more than a victim. She was a soul with stories still unwritten. In the middle of Breneisha's growing world stood one figure who would become both her partner and, in the end, her undoing: Michael Roarty-Nugent. He wasn't a stranger to the streets of Cleveland. Court records reveal a history stretching back a decade: drugs, domestic violence, weapons. For many, those were warnings. But to Breneisha, in the beginning, he was simply someone who listened, someone who appeared to care. They were often seen together, the kind of couple who could look inseparable in public. Social media posts hinted at moments of loyalty, smiles for the camera, captions of affection. But behind those snapshots, friends noticed something else: flashes of tension, a man who carried volatility just beneath the surface. There were whispers of control, of arguments that cut deeper than they should have. Yet in a life full of ambition, Breneisha gave her heart to him, perhaps believing love could soften the edges of his past. What outsiders didn't see was the fragile balance between hope and danger. On one side, a young woman building dreams. On the other, a man whose shadows never seemed far away. It is within this fragile bond that the seeds of tragedy were planted, seeds that would eventually grow into betrayal, violence, and the unthinkable. July 18th, 2023. It began like any other summer day in Bedford, Ohio. But by evening, a silence had settled around Breneisha's apartment, a silence that worried the people who knew her best. She was usually quick to answer her phone, to reply with a voice note, a text, a short laugh through the speaker. That day, the calls went unanswered. Messages stacked up, left undelivered but never read. Hours slipped by, and the worry began to harden into fear. Her family tried again and again, no response. Friends reached out, thinking maybe she was busy in the studio, maybe caught up with errands. But the longer the night stretched, the more unusual it felt. Something wasn't right. The next morning brought no relief. More calls, more silence. Social media quiet. No posts, no updates, no signs of her presence online. For someone so connected, so responsive, the absence was alarming. By the second day, the unease turned into urgency. A family member finally made the call that no loved one ever wants to make: a request for a welfare check. Police would soon arrive at her apartment door, stepping into an uneasy stillness that spoke louder than words. Inside, there were signs, subtle but chilling, that something violent had occurred. But Breneisha herself was nowhere to be found. For her loved ones, hope was slipping away with every unanswered ring, every empty hour. And in that void of silence, the question that haunted them most grew louder. Where was Breneisha? 3 days after the silence began, the truth emerged in the most devastating way. It was a Friday in Cleveland's Slavic village, a neighborhood marked by empty houses and streets that seemed to whisper of lives forgotten. On a patch of ground near East 64th and Francis Avenue, police made the discovery that confirmed everyone's worst fears. There, in a desolate corner of the city, lay the body of Breneisha Lightfoot. She had not been gently laid to rest. She had been discarded, abandoned, treated as if her life, her dreams, her very existence meant nothing. The scene was grim. Officers spoke quietly, their voices heavy with what they saw. For those who responded first, the shock was immediate. A young woman, once so full of life, now reduced to another crime scene in a city that had seen too many. Word traveled fast. Family members rushed to the area, their grief colliding with flashing lights and crime scene tape. Friends tried to process the impossible. The woman they knew as vibrant, fearless, and giving was gone, and gone in the most brutal of ways. Police did not have to search far for a suspect. The man closest to her, the one who should have protected her, was now in custody. From that moment, the tragedy was no longer a mystery of where. It had become a question of how. How could love twist into something so dark that it ended here, on the broken streets of Slavic village? Once the body was found, investigators began piecing together the fragments of a crime that never should have happened. Detectives traced their steps back to the Bedford apartment, combing through every corner for evidence. There were signs of struggle, marks that told a silent story of violence. What happened inside those walls was brutal, and it didn't end there. Evidence began to tie Michael Roarty-Nugent directly to the crime. He wasn't some unknown figure. He was the boyfriend, the man who had been with her last. And his own actions after her death revealed a chilling pattern. Attempts to cover his tracks, to move her body, to erase what he had done. That's where the charge of tampering with evidence took root. But investigators also discovered something even more disturbing: the way her body had been handled. What prosecutors would later call gross abuse of a corpse. It wasn't just the killing. It was the utter disregard that followed, a decision that turned violence into desecration. Theories swirled. Was it jealousy? A heated argument spiraling out of control? Was there a trigger buried in Roarty-Nugent's past, tied to the drugs, the violence, the weapons? Or was it something darker, a pattern of control that had finally reached its breaking point? The community whispered in fear and disbelief. How could someone so close to her be capable of something so cold? Police, meanwhile, moved carefully, building a case strong enough to withstand the weight of trial. And as they worked, one reality came into focus. This was not an accident. This was not chance. It was a deliberate act, born from choices that turned a home into a crime scene and left a family shattered forever. In the days after her body was recovered, the crime scene tape came down, but for her family, the nightmare was only beginning. They gathered in living rooms and church halls, clinging to photographs and memories, as if holding on tightly might somehow bring her back. Her mother described the silence in the house. No laughter spilling from the bedroom. No music pulsing through the walls. Just quiet and a grief too heavy to name. Her friends struggled to find words. Sunsir Shakur, who worked alongside her in the Wolfpack gunshot response team, spoke through tears. It's still very hard to digest. Anytime you lose someone like her, it forever haunts you. He remembered the children she mentored, the way their eyes lit up whenever she entered the room. To them, she wasn't just a volunteer. She was hope made real. Vigils soon filled the Cleveland nights. Dozens of candles flickered in the dark, their light reflecting off posters that carried her face. Strangers and friends alike whispered prayers, sang songs, and promised that her name would not be forgotten. But beneath the prayers was an anger that never quite left, a demand for accountability, for justice, for a system that too often seemed to fail young women like her. Her family's grief became a voice for others, a cry that this kind of loss could not become just another headline. Every tear, every broken sentence, every candle in the night was more than mourning. It was a call, a promise, that Breneisha's story would not end in silence. The courthouse in downtown Cleveland became the stage for the final chapter of this tragedy. It was here, under fluorescent lights and the watchful eyes of the public, that the story of Breneisha Lightfoot's death was told once more, this time in the sterile language of indictments and sentencing guidelines. When Michael Roarty-Nugent was first led into the courtroom in July of 2023, the weight of the charges against him was staggering. Murder, felonious assault, involuntary manslaughter, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a human corpse. Each count read aloud like a drumbeat, echoing in the tense silence of the room. Family members sat just feet away, clutching photographs of Breneisha, whispering prayers under their breath. Some could not bring themselves to look at him. Others stared hard, their eyes burning with anger and grief. The judge reminded everyone to remain calm. Yet the air inside was heavy, not just with sorrow, but with the sense that justice was finally within reach. As the weeks passed, the grand jury indictment gave way to pretrial hearings. Prosecutors outlined the evidence, the injuries found in her apartment, the attempts to conceal what had happened, and the discovery of her body in Cleveland's Slavic village. They described his actions afterward, the cold calculation of moving her remains, the disturbing lack of humanity. Defense attorneys pushed back, painting a picture of a man caught in circumstances beyond control. They spoke of poor decisions, of moments of rage rather than premeditation. But no argument could soften the reality that a young woman's life had been violently ended. When the trial itself reached its turning point, the focus narrowed. The murder charge was dropped, but the accusations that remained were damning. Involuntary manslaughter, tampering with evidence, and gross abuse of a corpse. The courtroom heard from investigators who walked jurors through photographs and timelines. The details were graphic, the kind that make even seasoned detectives shift uncomfortably in their seats. Every exhibit, every testimony, painted the picture of a life cut short and a crime committed without mercy. Then came the voices that shook the room, victim impact statements. Family members rose, one by one, to address the court. Some spoke softly, their grief almost too much to carry. Others raised their voices in anguish, demanding that the justice system see the full weight of what was lost. One relative described Breneisha's laughter, how it once filled the house. Another spoke of the children she mentored, children now asking why Miss Bree never came back. Their words were raw, unfiltered, and each one landed like a blow on the man who sat in the defendant's chair. Judge Dina R. Calabrese listened carefully. She had presided over countless cases, but this one was different, not because of the brutality alone, but because of the community that surrounded it. The letters sent to her chambers, the vigils outside the courthouse, the sheer number of people demanding accountability. Finally, the moment arrived. The judge called the defendant to stand. The room fell silent, breaths held, as she read the decision. On the count of involuntary manslaughter, guilty. On the count of tampering with evidence, guilty. On the count of gross abuse of a human corpse, guilty. The sentence, 23 to 28.5 years in prison. Gasps filled the room. Some wept quietly. Others nodded in grim acceptance. For the family, it was a bittersweet victory. Justice, yes, but never closure. For the community, it was a warning. Even love can become dangerous when wrapped in violence and control. As deputies placed handcuffs back on Roarty-Nugent and prepared to escort him away, he glanced briefly toward the gallery. There were no words of apology, no visible sign of remorse. Only the sound of shackles as he was led out of the room, disappearing into the custody of the state. Outside, the family gathered on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed. Microphones were held out, but many were too overwhelmed to speak. One friend finally stepped forward. "This is justice, but it doesn't bring her back. We still feel the void every single day." And so, the courtroom chapter closed. Not with triumph, but with the quiet understanding that no sentence, no number of years, could ever equal the value of the life that was lost. When the sentence was handed down and the gavel fell, the legal battle was over. But outside the courtroom, the story of Breneisha Lightfoot was still being written. In the neighborhoods where she once walked, her absence left a mark. The children she mentored through the Wolfpack gunshot response team kept asking the same question: when will Miss Bree be back? Their instructors had to find the words to explain that she wasn't coming back, but that the lessons she left behind would continue to protect them. Community leaders began organizing events in her name. Workshops on domestic violence awareness, youth safety demonstrations, candlelit marches through Cleveland streets where voices carried her memory forward. Each gathering was both a mourning and a rallying cry. That her death should not be forgotten, and that others must be protected before it's too late. Her name appeared on flyers, T-shirts, murals painted on neighborhood walls. Artists in the city, rappers, poets, dancers, dedicated their work to her, saying she had been a symbol of ambition and hope in a place too often defined by loss. The echoes of her story traveled beyond Cleveland. News outlets, podcasts, and true crime forums carried her name into living rooms across the country. For some, it became a cautionary tale about trust and hidden danger. For others, it was a reminder of how domestic violence can silently grow inside relationships that look ordinary on the outside. Police and advocates joined her family in urging the public to remain vigilant. They reminded people that help exists: hotlines, shelters, crisis centers, for those who feel trapped in unsafe relationships. The message was clear: no one should wait until it is too late. For her family, the fight became personal. They vowed that her legacy would not be defined by how she died, but by how she lived, teaching, inspiring, and lifting others. They established scholarships and community drives in her memory, turning grief into action, sorrow into service. And as months passed, the memory of Breneisha became larger than a single tragedy. She became a face of resilience, a reminder to young women that they are worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth remembering. Her story, though heartbreaking, lit a fire in her city, a fire of awareness, of advocacy, of voices rising together to say, never again. Not here, not to someone like her. In the end, the story of Breneisha Lightfoot is not just about crime or punishment. It's about a life full of music, mentorship, and dreams, stolen in an act of betrayal that should never have happened. She was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a teacher, and a rising voice in her community. Her legacy is carried in the children she helped, in the friends who loved her, and in the voices that now speak her name with reverence and sorrow. The sentence handed to her killer may keep him behind bars, but it will never fill the void her absence created. For her family, the pain does not end with justice. For her community, the challenge now is to ensure no other young woman suffers the same fate. So what do we take away from this tragedy? We are reminded that love should never come with fear, that silence in the face of danger can cost lives, that communities must rise together to protect their daughters, sisters, and friends. If you've been moved by Breneisha's story, don't let it fade when this video ends. Share her name, share her legacy, stand with those who are vulnerable, and speak out against violence when you see it. And to you, our viewers, if this story touched you, please like this video, share it so her story reaches farther, and subscribe so we can continue bringing you the stories that must never be forgotten. Your support helps keep these voices alive. For the sake of her family, her community, and her memory, we must keep speaking her name. This was the story of Breneisha Lightfoot. May her light never be dimmed.